The Bajoran High Commander laughed when he saw the pathetically small army mustering against his forces, until he realized with a shock, those were human soldiers. In the capital city of Lotsia, a tense standoff unfolded between the reptilian warriors of the mighty Bajoran Empire and a tiny force of soldiers from an upstart pre-FTL species known as humanity. The humans had been providing humanitarian aid to the oppressed Losian people, who languished under the brutal boot of their Bajoran overlords. Now the Bajorans intended to put an end to the humans' meddling. High Commander Fenris himself landed in the heart of the city, disembarking his dropship with a cohort of snarling, heavily armed elite troopers. The 8-foot reptilian warlord strutted across the plaza, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement as he took in the ragtag band of humans assembled before him. A mere 5,000 human soldiers stood against Fenris's armored division of 50,000 Bajoran warriors. The humans clutched primitive kinetic weapons and huddled behind light-armored vehicles. In stark contrast, the Bajorans wielded advanced plasma rifles, hovered in menacing battle tanks, and filled the skies with weaponized gunships. Fenris threw back his scaled head and laughed, a harsh grating sound. He pointed one sharp talon at the human commander, a grizzled veteran named Greg Adams, who received Fenris with a face of stone. "Withdraw now, Earther scum," Fenris spat in heavily accented galactic common. "Flee this planet with your tail between your legs, or stay and be annihilated. This is your only warning." Commander Adams met the alien's glare with flinty eyes. "We're not going anywhere, Lizard. The occupation of Lotsia ends today, one way or another. I suggest you get back on your ships while you still can." The Bajoran officers behind Fenris chittered and howled with laughter at the human's audacity. "I will enjoy breaking your species," Fenris hissed. "Your survivors will make excellent slaves, and your planets will provide useful resources for the Empire." "So you have 1 hour to leave," Fenris concluded. Then he turned with a snap of his cape and strode back to his dropship, chuckling all the way. The Bajorans were already boasting about which Losian females they would rape first, after their assured victory over the pitiful human forces. But Commander Adams and his soldiers had no intention of abandoning the Losian people. The humans knew they were outmatched and outgunned, yet they were the only hope Losia had left. The human soldiers checked their weapons with unyielding commitment, prepared to fight to the bitter end. They all knew that the Losians would be brutally crushed if the humans retreated now, and Earth could not afford to show weakness in its first conflict with a galactic power. This battle would be humanity's introduction to the stars, and it had to be a resounding triumph. The Bajorans would soon discover that underestimating humans was the worst mistake they could make. When the 1-hour ultimatum expired, they would learn that even a small group of humans could accomplish the impossible. As the minutes ticked down to the expiration of Fenris's ultimatum, Commander Adams gathered his troops. He stood before them, a hardened veteran of countless battles, his eyes filled with steely purpose. "Listen up, men," Greg began, his voice carrying across the assembled soldiers. "The rules of engagement have changed. These Bajoran bastards want a fight? Well, we're going to give them one they won't soon forget." The human soldiers nodded grimly, their expressions determined as they checked their weapons and gear one final time. They loaded fresh magazines into their rifles, strapped on extra armor plates, and whispered prayers to whatever gods they believed in. Greg stepped away from his men and keyed his radio. "Fenris, this is Commander Adams. We will not be complying with your ultimatum. If you want this planet, you're going to have to come and take it." The reply was immediate and furious. "You fool!" Fenris snarled over the comlink. "You have just doomed yourself and your pathetic band of primitives to a painful death. When I'm done with you, I will hang your corpse from the ruins of your capital city as a warning to all who would defy the Bajoran Empire." Greg just smiled coldly. "Come and get us, you scaly son of a bitch." As the deadline arrived, the Bajoran forces began to advance on the human perimeter. Fenris watched smugly from his command tank, already savoring his impending victory over these upstart apes. He gave the order for his armored units to open fire, expecting to blast the human positions to rubble in seconds. But instead of the anticipated massacre, Fenris was shocked to see the human lines erupt with blinding muzzle flashes and deafening roars that exceeded anything their primitive firearms should have been capable of. Hyper-accelerated kinetic rounds tore through the Bajoran vehicle's armored hulls, like they were made of papier-mâché, the immense kinetic energy instantly liquefying the crews inside. Massive shell casings, each as long as a grown man's forearm, clattered to the ground around the human positions, smoking and sizzling. Too late, the Bajorans realized the humans had been concealing rail cannons and Gauss rifles, not ordinary slug throwers. Greg keyed his radio again, a savage grin splitting his face. "All call signs, weapons free. I say again, weapons free. Let 'em have it, boys." As if on cue, human artillery and mortars opened up from concealed positions, raining fiery destruction down on the Bajoran rear echelon. The aliens' advance faltered, then collapsed entirely as the battered remnants of their lead elements threw their vehicles into reverse, desperate to get out of the kill zone. Fenris howled with rage as he watched his unstoppable armored spearhead disintegrate before his eyes. The humans' accursed technology had completely blindsided him. He'd underestimated these Earthers, a mistake he did not intend to repeat. The Bajoran warlord pounded his fist on the turret of his command tank, drawing blood from his scaled knuckles. He vowed that before this day was done, he would bathe in the blood of every human on this miserable planet. No matter the cost, Lotsia would be his. But even as Fenris's warriors regrouped for another assault, the humans were already on the move. Camouflage netting was thrown back to reveal Humvees mounting quad-linked anti-tank missiles and power-armored infantry armed with shoulder-fired rockets. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Inside his mobile command post, Fenris smacked his head on the holotable, making the tactical display flicker. "Someone tell me what in the seven hells is going on out there," the Bajoran warlord roared, his eyes blazing with fury as he watched his armored units getting torn to shreds by the humans' inexplicable weapons. His subordinates worked frantically at their stations, desperately trying to make sense of the situation. One of them, a young officer named Krelok, spoke up hesitantly. "High Commander, our scans indicate the humans are employing advanced weaponry we've never encountered before. Some kind of electromagnetic acceleration technology, rail guns and Gauss cannons." Fenris whirled on him, talons flexing. "I can see that, you fool, but how did we not know about this? Our intelligence reported they were a primitive species." Krelok swallowed hard, his scales turning pale. "Unknown, sir. But the projectiles, they're moving at immense velocities. The kinetic energy is simply overwhelming our armor. It was designed to withstand high-heat energy weapons, not physical impact on this scale." Fenris cut him off with a snarl. He stabbed a finger at the display, indicating the battered remnants of his first wave falling back. "Redirect the reserves to hit their flanks, and get our gunships in the air. We'll see how their toy soldiers handle a strafing run." As the Bajoran gunships lifted off and raced towards the front lines, Commander Adams watched them approach on his helmet's HUD. He keyed his comm. "Man-pad teams, you're up. Light 'em up, boys." All along the human perimeter, shoulder-mounted launchers snapped up and took aim. A heartbeat later, a volley of anti-air missiles streaked into the sky, the advanced seeker heads locking onto the gunship's energy signatures like bloodhounds catching a scent. The missiles crossed the distance in seconds, tiny but deadly. Just before impact, the impactor cores separated, dense spikes of tungsten and depleted uranium backed by shaped charges. They hit like the fist of an angry god, punching through the gunship's hulls and shredding the critical systems within. Fenris could only watch in disbelief as his air support plummeted out of the sky, trailing fire and smoke. Seconds later, the human artillery shifted their aim, saturating the landing zones of his reserve forces with a deadly accurate barrage. The Bajoran reinforcements scattered and broke before they could even join the fight. Fenris pounded the holotable again, leaving a dent in the hardened metal. His mind raced, trying to formulate a plan, some way to neutralize these damned human weapons that were slaughtering his warriors. There had to be something. Kraluk's voice snapped him out of his thoughts, high and panicked. "Incoming fire, mortar rounds, danger close." Fenris' head snapped up, his eyes going wide as the command post's threat sensors screamed in alarm. He had just enough time to see the human mortar shells arcing down towards him. The Bajoran warlord opened his mouth to bellow an order, but all that came out was a wordless roar of pure rage. Then the world turned white as the roof of the command post vanished in a blinding flash of fire and shrapnel. Fenris felt a moment of searing heat, then nothing at all as the shockwaves slammed him into oblivion. The Bajoran lines crumbled into a panicked rout as word spread of Fenris's demise. Colonel Naxos, the most senior surviving officer, found himself suddenly in command of the entire invasion force. He barked orders into his comm, trying to salvage what he could of the deteriorating situation. "All units, this is Colonel Naxos. Fall back to the LZ for immediate dust-off. We need to regroup and resupply. Rear guard, buy us as much time as you can. Slow the humans down." As the Bajorans disengaged and fled, Commander Adams saw his chance to press the advantage. He keyed his radio, his voice full of unshakable focus. "They're on the run, boys. Don't let up now. Dog 1, I need your snipers to pick off their officers and heavy gunners. All infantry units, keep the pressure on their rear guard. Armor, push forward and cut off their retreat wherever you can. Let's finish this." The human forces surged forward like a relentless tide. Sniper teams, equipped with advanced targeting scopes and high-powered rifles, began methodically eliminating Bajoran leaders and specialists with lethal efficiency. The hypervelocity rounds punched through the aliens' helmets like they were made of glass, splattering purple blood and brain matter across the cratered ground. Infantry squads advanced in bounding overwatch, laying down suppressing fire with their gas rifles as they leapfrogged forward. The Bajoran rearguard tried to hold them back, firing frantically from behind the burning wrecks of their vehicles, but they were outmatched and outnumbered. Suddenly a Bajoran platoon found itself cut off and surrounded by human armor. The alien's nerve broke and one of them raised a scrap of dirty white cloth on a pole, waving it frantically. "Humans, we surrender, please, we surrender," the Bajoran platoon leader called out in broken galactic common. A human squad, led by Sergeant Hawkins, advanced cautiously with weapons trained on the surrendering Bajorans. Hawkins gestured for the aliens to throw down their weapons and raise their hands. Just as Hawkins' men began to relax, the Bajoran leader snarled and whipped a concealed plasma pistol from behind his back. He fired point-blank into the face of the lead human soldier, vaporizing his head in a flash of blue energy. The other Bajorans produced hidden weapons and opened fire in a treacherous ambush. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air and seared into human flesh. "Shit, it's a trick!" Hawkins bellowed. He dove for cover behind the blackened husk of a Bajoran tank, wincing as a plasma bolt singed his shoulder pauldron. His men reacted instantly, finding what cover they could and returning fire. The deafening roar of human gas rifles drowned out the whine of Bajoran plasma weapons. Armor-piercing slugs ripped through the aliens' bodies, shredding them into bloody chunks of purple meat. In seconds, the Bajoran platoon was reduced to shattered corpses and twitching limbs. Hawkins got on the radio, his breathing heavy. "Boss, we just had a Bajoran fake surrender. Bastards tried to ambush us under a white flag. Tucker's dead. Hernandez and Choi are wounded." Greg's voice came back, cold as ice. "Roger that, Sergeant. Get your wounded treated and keep moving. All call signs be advised. The Bajorans have violated the laws of war. No more accepting surrenders, no quartermen. These bastards had their chance." As the battle raged on, Ambassador Sinclair watched the live feed from orbit, her face pale. She opened a channel to Greg, her voice shaking. "Commander Adams, I must protest. You can't just execute prisoners. That's a war crime." Greg's reply was sharp and uncompromising. "With respect, Madam Ambassador, this is war, not a police action. I don't have the luxury of risking my men's lives by disarming Bajorans who have already proven they'll violate the laws of war. I'll accept Fenris' formal surrender when the time comes, but until then, we do this my way." Before the ambassador could respond, Greg cut the transmission. He turned to his troops, his eyes hard. "You heard the orders, men. Keep advancing, no stopping until every last one of these scaly bastards is dead or running. Move out." The human forces redoubled their efforts, pushing the Bajorans back block by blood-soaked block. The aliens were in full retreat now, but the humans were hot on their heels, harrying them with sniper fire and artillery strikes. They would run them down like dogs, all the way to the landing zones if they had to. As dusk settled over the battlefield, the battered Bajoran forces fell back to a hilltop position, hoping to regroup and hold out until reinforcements could arrive. Colonel Naxos, his face streaked with soot and blood, barked orders to his troops as they hastily dug trenches and erected fortifications. "Get those heavy guns emplaced," Naxos shouted, pointing to the anti-air batteries being towed into position. "I want a perimeter set up now. Sentries, stay sharp. The humans will be coming for us." A young lieutenant approached Naxos, his hand pressed to a bloody gash on his forehead. "Sir, I have word from command. An armored division is en route to our position. They'll be here by dawn." Naxos nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Good. We just have to hold out until then. Tell the men to dig in deep. It's going to be a long night." As the Bajorans worked frantically to shore up their defenses, the humans were already on the move. Commander Adams stood at the edge of a ridge overlooking the Bajoran position, studying their fortifications through a pair of night vision binoculars. He noted the heavy weapon emplacements and the anti-air batteries, his mind racing with calculations. Greg lowered the binoculars and turned to the black-clad figures assembled behind him. "Listen up, boys. We've got one shot at this. I need those AA guns taken out before dawn. Once they're down, we'll hit them with everything we've got from the air." The Special Forces troopers nodded, their faces grim beneath the black camouflage paint. They checked their suppressed weapons one last time, making sure each magazine was loaded with armor-piercing rounds. "We'll get it done, boss," said Sergeant Hawkins, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "They won't even know what hit them." Greg clasped Hawkins on the shoulder. "Good hunting, Sergeant. Give 'em hell." As the humans set up a perimeter around the hilltop, illuminating the Bajoran positions with flares and searchlights, the Special Forces teams began their silent approach. They moved in small groups, using the cover of darkness and the uneven terrain to mask their advance. When they neared the Bajoran lines, the troopers activated their adaptive camouflage. Their battlesuits shimmered and shifted, the colors and patterns blending seamlessly with the surrounding environment. To the untrained eye, they seemed to vanish into the night, becoming little more than ghostly shadows. The troopers crept past Bajoran sentries, their footsteps inaudible over the distant explosions and gunfire. They planted demolition charges on the anti-air guns and missile batteries, each placement calculated for maximum damage. Once the charges were set, the troopers faded back into the darkness, retreating to a safe distance. Greg watched from his vantage point, his finger hovering over the detonator. "All teams report in," he whispered into his radio. One by one, the team leaders confirmed their charges were in place. Greg took a deep breath, then pressed the button. The hilltop erupted in a series of blinding flashes and deafening booms. The explosions ripped through the Bajoran defenses, turning the anti-air guns into twisted wreckage and sending shock waves through the earth. Bajoran soldiers were thrown from their feet, many of them stunned or wounded by the blasts. In the chaos, the Special Forces troopers sprang into action. They materialized out of the smoke and flames, their suppressed rifles coughing out short, deadly bursts. Stunned Bajorans fell before they could even raise their weapons, their armor no match for the troopers' armor-piercing rounds. Colonel Naxos staggered out of his bunker, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. He saw dark figures moving through the destruction, cutting down his soldiers with ruthless efficiency. Naxos raised his plasma rifle, his hands shaking with rage and fear. Before he could fire, a trooper appeared before him, little more than a shimmering outline against the flames. Naxos saw the muzzle flash, felt the impact of the bullet slamming into his skull. Then he saw nothing at all. As the remaining Bajorans fired blindly into the night, The troopers melted back into the shadows, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. The anti-air defenses were in ruins, the Bajoran forces scattered and leaderless. Greg watched the carnage unfold, a grim smile on his lips. The Bajorans had thought themselves superior, had underestimated the tenacity and ingenuity of humanity. Now they were paying the price for their arrogance. But the battle was just getting started. The Bajoran reinforcements were still on their way, and the humans had to be ready for them. Greg keyed his radio, his voice hard. "All units, prepare for Phase 2. Air support will be here at dawn. Let's finish this." As the first rays of dawn painted the horizon in shades of orange and red, the rumble of engines and the clatter of treads filled the air. Bajoran reinforcements had arrived, a seemingly endless column of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles kicking up clouds of dust as they approached the human lines. In the lead tank, General Zaxos surveyed the battlefield through his periscope. He saw smoke rising from the hilltop where Colonel Naxos had made his last stand, and assumed the colonel had already engaged the enemy. "All units, charge forward," Zaxos barked into his comm. "Encircle the humans and crush them between our forces." The Bajoran tanks surged ahead, their drivers eager to grind the human upstarts beneath their treads. Infantry transports followed close behind, packed with heavily armed warriors ready to finish off any survivors. Suddenly a new sound filled the air, the scream of human aircraft engines. Zaxos looked up, his eyes widening at the sight of sleek, angular fighters tearing across the sky. The human craft moved like nothing he had ever seen, their vectored thrust engines allowing them to perform maneuvers that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The lead fighter banked hard, lining up on Zaxos' tank. A panel opened on the aircraft's underside, and a guided bomb dropped free, plummeting towards the Bajoran vehicle. Zaxos had a fraction of a second to feel a surge of fear before the bomb struck. The tandem warhead punched through the tank's thick frontal armor like it was made of paper, burying itself deep inside before detonating. The explosion vaporized Zaxos and his crew instantly, reducing the once formidable war machine to a burning husk of twisted metal. The other human fighters followed suit, raining guided munitions down on the Bajoran armored vehicles with merciless precision. The bombs struck engine compartments, ammunition stores, and fuel tanks, turning the massed Bajoran forces into a sea of flames and devastation. Infantry transports swerved wildly, their drivers desperately trying to avoid the burning wrecks of the tanks. But there was no escape from the human ground forces. Advanced tanks and IFVs, their weapons guided by cutting-edge fire control systems, picked off the Bajoran transports one by one, the lightly armored vehicles offering no protection against the human guns. On the hilltop, Commander Adams saw the chaos unfolding below and knew it was time to press the attack. "All units advance," he ordered over the comm. "Keep the pressure on, don't give them a chance to regroup." As one, the human forces surged forward, pouring down the hillside like an avalanche of steel and fire. Tanks and IFVs led the charge, their guns roaring as they engaged the scattered remnants of the Bajoran armor. Infantry squads followed close behind, leapfrogging from cover to cover, as they engaged the enemy with short, deadly bursts from their Gauss rifles. In the midst of the carnage, a lone Bajoran soldier huddled behind the burning wreck of a transport. With shaking hands, he keyed his field radio, desperate to send a message to High Command. "This is Private Kraylock," he screamed into the mic, his voice raw with terror. "The reinforcements have been destroyed. Repeat, the reinforcements are gone. We need immediate extraction. Please, you have to get us out of—" A burst of Gauss rifle fire cut his transmission short as a trio of hypersonic rounds struck him in the back. The rounds punched through his armor like it wasn't even there, pulverizing his internal organs and hurling his lifeless body forward into the dust. Miles away, in the heart of the Bajoran capital, the High Council sat in stunned silence as they listened to Kraylock's final transmission. The raw fear in the young soldier's voice, the sounds of utter destruction in the background, it painted a picture of total, overwhelming defeat. As the recording ended, the councillors exchanged looks of shock and disbelief. They had been so certain of their superiority, so confident that the primitive humans would be no match for the might of the Bajoran war machine. But now the truth was impossible to ignore. The humans had outfought and outclassed them at every turn, wielding technology far beyond anything the Bajorans had ever seen. And now, the pride of their military lay shattered and burning on the plains of Losaria. One of the councillors, an old warhawk named Craxon, smacked his head on the table, his face twisted with rage. "This is impossible," he snarled. "There must be some mistake, some trick. No mere apes could defeat the Bajoran Empire." But even as the words left his mouth, Craxon knew they rang hollow. The proof was right there in front of them, in the desperate pleas of their dying soldiers and the smoke rising from the battlefield. The humans had done the unthinkable, and now the Bajorans faced a terrifying new reality, one in which they were no longer the undisputed masters of the galaxy, one in which their very survival hung in the balance. On the battlefield, Greg stood atop the turret of his IFV, watching as the last pockets of Bajoran resistance were systematically eliminated by his advancing forces. The smell of burning metal and charred flesh filled his nostrils, but he paid it no mind. His focus was solely on the task at hand, the complete and total defeat of the enemy. "Sir, we've got Bajoran soldiers surrendering en masse," reported Sergeant Hawkins over the comm. "What are your orders?" Greg's eyes narrowed, remembering the Bajoran treachery from before. For a moment he was tempted to order his men to gun down the surrendering aliens, to make them pay for their deceit. But as much as he hated to admit it, he knew that would make him no better than the Bajorans, and humanity had to be better, had to show that, even in victory, they still held to their principles. "Disarm and detain them," he replied, his voice firm. "Treat any wounded but keep them under guard, and make sure they understand that any further treachery will be met with lethal force." "Roger that, boss," Hawkins acknowledged. "We'll handle it." As the human soldiers moved to secure the Bajoran prisoners, Greg allowed himself a small, grim smile. The battle for Lotsia was all but won, but he knew this was just the beginning. The Bajorans would not take this defeat lightly. They would be back with new weapons and new strategies, determined to crush the upstart humans who had humiliated them. But Greg and his soldiers would be ready for them. They had proven beyond any doubt that humanity was a force to be reckoned with, and they would continue to prove it, on battlefields across the stars, for as long as it took to secure humanity's place in the galaxy. The road ahead would be long and bloody, Greg knew, but he also knew that no matter the odds, no matter the challenges, humanity would never stop fighting. They would never surrender. For this was their destiny, their birthright, to stand tall among the stars, to forge their own path, to show the galaxy what it meant to be human. And God help anyone who tried to stand in their way. On the bridge of his flagship, Admiral Kraylock paced back and forth, his clawed feet clicking against the metal deck. The holographic display in the center of the bridge showed the situation on the planet's surface. The human forces had the Bajorans pinned down and were inflicting heavy casualties. Kraylock's second-in-command, a young officer named Zanak, approached him cautiously. "Admiral, we've received a distress signal from the surface. They're requesting immediate orbital bombardment of the human positions." Kraylock whirled on Zanak, his eyes narrowing. "Bombardment? With our own troops still on the ground?" Zanak swallowed hard, but held his ground. "Yes, sir. The human resistance is too strong. They don't see any other way." Kraylock turned back to the holographic display, his mind racing. He knew an orbital strike would likely kill many of his own soldiers, but if he didn't act, the humans would slaughter them all anyway. He made his decision. "Prepare to fire main batteries," he ordered, his voice grim. "Target the human positions, but try to avoid our own troops as much as possible." The bridge crew hurried to comply, their fingers flying over their consoles. On the planet's surface, Greg's radio crackled to life. "Commander, we've got incoming from orbit." Sergeant Hawkins' voice was tense. "Energy signatures consistent with Bajoran ship-to-surface batteries." Greg cursed under his breath. He had hoped to avoid this, but the Bajorans were getting desperate. All units prepare for orbital bombardment, he barked into the radio. Spread out and find cover, now. The human soldiers scrambled to obey, diving into trenches and bunkers, huddling behind the wrecks of Bajoran vehicles. Moments later, the first energy bolts slammed into the ground, the impacts throwing up huge plumes of dirt and debris. The bolts vaporized everything they touched, leaving behind massive craters and clouds of superheated plasma. Human and Bajoran soldiers alike were caught in the blasts, their bodies instantly reduced to ash. Greg gritted his teeth as the ground shook beneath him, the shock waves threatening to toss him off his feet. He watched as a bolt struck a human tank, the armored vehicle vanishing in a blinding flash of light. But even as the Bajorans pounded the human positions, Greg's forces fought back. Human anti-air batteries opened fire, filling the sky with flak and missiles. The Bajoran ships' shields flared as they were hit, the impacts rocking the massive vessels. On the ground, human tanks and IFVs emerged from their cover, their guns roaring as they engaged the Bajoran landing forces. The Bajorans fought back fiercely, plasma bolts and railgun slugs crisscrossing the battlefield. Greg led from the front, his own IFV at the tip of the human spear. He could see the Bajoran perimeter crumbling under the relentless human assault, the alien soldiers falling back in disarray. "Push forward," he shouted over the comm. "Don't let up, we've got them on the ropes." The human forces surged ahead, closing in on the Bajoran landing zone. The ground was littered with the burning wrecks of Bajoran dropships and the bodies of alien soldiers. Suddenly, a massive energy bolt slammed into the ground just ahead of Greg's IFV, the shockwave throwing the vehicle into the air like a toy. Greg felt a moment of weightlessness, then a bone-jarring impact as the IFV crashed back to Earth. Ears ringing, vision blurred, Greg shook his head to clear it. He could taste blood in his mouth, feel it trickling down his face from a gash on his forehead. Around him, the interior of the IFV was a mess of sparking consoles and flickering lights. He could hear his crew groaning, struggling to pick themselves up. Greg keyed his radio, his voice ragged. "All units, status reports." Greg struggled to his feet, his head pounding. He wiped the blood from his eyes and looked around the interior of the wrecked IFV. His crew was battered but alive, already moving to grab their weapons and gear. "Sound off," Greg barked, his voice ragged. "Hawkins, Chen, Ramirez, you good?" One by one his crew responded, their voices strained but determined. They were bruised and bloodied but ready to keep fighting. Greg popped the hatch and climbed out of the IFV, surveying the battlefield. What he saw made his blood run cold. Massive energy bolts rained down from the sky, each one vaporizing everything it touched. Tanks, IFVs, and soldiers vanished in blinding flashes of light, leaving behind nothing but scorched earth and molten metal. The Bajorans were bombarding their own positions, willing to sacrifice their ground forces to defeat the humans. The realization hit Greg like a punch to the gut. He keyed his radio, his voice urgent. "All units, fall back and disperse. Get out of the kill zone now." The human forces reacted instantly, scattering like leaves in the wind. Tanks and IFVs gunned their engines, weaving erratic patterns to avoid the deadly rain from above. Infantry squads broke into small fire teams, using their adaptive camouflage to blend in with the terrain as they moved. Greg watched helplessly as a pair of human tanks vanished in a blinding flash, the energy bolt reducing them to molten slag in an instant. He cursed under his breath, his fists clenched in rage. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, a new voice crackled over the radio. "Commander Adams, this is Captain Alvarez of the EFS Titan. The cavalry has arrived." Greg's head snapped up, his eyes wide. He scanned the sky, hardly daring to hope. There, emerging from the clouds like a vengeful angel, was the massive bulk of an Earth battleship. Its hull gleamed in the sunlight, jam-packed with weapons batteries and point defense turrets. The Titan opened fire, its advanced mass drivers hurling hypersonic projectiles at the Bajoran fleet. The human ship's shields flared as the Bajoran ships returned fire, but they held strong. The Bajoran vessels tried to maneuver, desperate to bring their weapons to bear on the human behemoth. But the Titans' AI-assisted targeting systems tracked their every move, predicting their trajectories and adjusting fire in real time. Bajoran ships shuddered and broke apart under the relentless barrage, their hulls splintering like kindling. Escape pods and debris spilled from the ruined vessels, spiraling down toward the planet's surface. On the ground, Greg felt a surge of renewed hope. He rallied his remaining forces, his voice firm over the radio. "All units, this is Commander Adams. The tide is turning. Prepare for a final push. We're going to drive these bastards off our world once and for all." The human soldiers responded with a resounding cheer, their spirits buoyed by the sight of the Earth fleet in the sky above. Greg knew the Bajorans would be desperate to evacuate their remaining troops before the Titan could destroy their entire fleet. He ordered his anti-air units to redeploy, setting up a deadly gauntlet for any Bajoran dropships that tried to land. His armored units moved to cut off the Bajoran retreat, their engines roaring as they charged across the cratered battlefield. As predicted, the Bajoran dropships came in low and fast, skimming the ground to avoid the Titan's fire. A screen of gunships flew ahead of them, their weapons spitting plasma at the human positions. Greg's anti-air units opened fire, filling the sky with a hail of missiles and flak. The gunships weaved and dodged, trying to draw the fire away from the dropships. Several gunships erupted into flames, spiraling out of control and slamming into the ground. But the dropships kept coming, their pilots determined to rescue their stranded comrades. Greg climbed into his personal tank, the massive war machine thrumming with power. He swung the main gun around, lining up a shot on a Bajoran armored transport. The tank's computer chimed a lock, and Greg squeezed the trigger. The gun roared, the hypervelocity round slamming into the Bajoran vehicle and ripping it apart from the inside out. All around him, the battle degenerated into a brutal close-quarters brawl. Human and Bajoran soldiers fought hand-to-hand amidst the wreckage of burning vehicles, their weapons forgotten in the mad scramble for survival. Greg saw a Bajoran soldier tackle a human trooper, the alien's claws tearing at the man's face. Greg drew his sidearm and put a round through the Bajoran's skull, spattering purple blood across the ground. For a moment, it seemed the Bajorans might overwhelm the humans through sheer numbers and ferocity. But then a flight of human fighters screamed overhead, their missiles locked onto the Bajoran dropships. The missiles streaked down from the sky, leaving trails of white smoke behind them. They slammed into the dropships, the explosions tearing through their hulls smoothly. Dropships crashed to the ground in flames, their crews consumed by the infernos raging within. The Bajoran soldiers on the ground watched in horror as their last hope of escape vanished before their eyes. One by one, the aliens threw down their weapons, their scaly hands raised in surrender. The human soldiers moved in, wary of another trick, but the fight had gone out of the Bajorans. Greg climbed out of his tank, his face streaked with soot and blood. He looked up at the sky, where the Titan hung like a guardian angel, its guns still firing at the fleeing remnants of the Bajoran fleet. The battle was over. The humans had won. But as Greg surveyed the devastation around him, he knew the cost had been high. The dead and wounded lay everywhere, human and Bajoran alike. This was just the beginning, Greg knew. The Bajorans would be back, with new weapons and new strategies, and there were other threats out there, lurking in the darkness of space. But for now, the humans could savor their victory. They had shown the galaxy what they were made of, and the Bajorans would not soon forget the lesson they had learned on this bloody day. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of battle faded, Greg Adams stood amidst the ruins of the Bajoran encampment. The stench of burning metal and charred flesh assaulted his nostrils, a grim reminder of the day's bloody work. Around him, the human soldiers tended to their own. Medics triaged the wounded, applying pressure to gushing wounds and injecting morphine to dull the screams of the dying. Soldiers collected dog tags from the fallen, their faces grim as they prepared their brothers and sisters for the long journey home. Greg's eyes scanned the battlefield, taking in the shattered remains of Bajoran tanks and the twisted corpses of their crews. Purple blood mingled with red on the scorched earth, a morbid testament to the savagery of the conflict. A commotion drew his attention. 2 human soldiers dragged a Bajoran officer before him, the alien's once pristine uniform now tattered and stained with filth. The Bajoran glared up at Greg, defiance and hatred etched into his reptilian features. "You may have won this battle, human," the Bajoran hissed, his words dripping with venom, "but you have only brought more suffering upon yourselves. The Bajoran Empire will not forget this humiliation. We will return, and we will have our revenge." Greg met the Bajoran's gaze, his own eyes hard as flint. He leaned in close, his voice low and deadly. "So you had your chance for peace," he growled. "You chose war, and now you must face the consequences." Greg turned to the soldiers holding the Bajoran. "Get this piece of shit out of my sight. Secure the prisoners for transport to Earth. They'll answer for their crimes soon enough." As the soldiers dragged the Bajoran away, Sergeant Hawkins approached, his face streaked with soot and blood. "Sir, word from orbit. The Bajoran fleet bugged out. They jumped to hyperspace as soon as the Titan showed up. The flyboys upstairs have secured orbital supremacy." Greg nodded, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Good. That'll make our job down here a little easier. But this is nowhere near the end, Hawkins. The Bajorans will be back, and they'll be out for blood." Hawkins spat on the ground. "Let 'em come. We'll be ready for round 2. Greg said nothing. He knew the cost of victory all too well. He had lost good men and women today, soldiers who would never see their families again, and those who survived would carry the scars of this battle for the rest of their lives, both seen and unseen. As he looked out over the devastation, Greg felt a bone-deep weariness settle over him. In all his years of service, he had never felt so tired, so hollow. For a moment he allowed himself to wonder if there could have been another way, if the price of victory was worth the toll it took on the soul. But he pushed those thoughts aside. He had a job to do, a duty to his soldiers and to the people of Lozia. The Bajorans had sown the wind, and now they would reap the whirlwind. Greg straightened his shoulders and turned to face his men. There was work still to be done, and he would see it through to the end. For better or worse, this was the path he had chosen, the path of the warrior, the path of the defender. And he would walk it at any expense. As the dust settled over the battlefield, the human soldiers set about the grim task of tending to the wounded and securing the Bajoran prisoners. Medics rushed from one casualty to the next, applying pressure bandages and administering morphine to those in agony. The air was filled with the groans of the injured and the barked orders of the officers organizing the triage. Greg wiped the sweat and grime from his brow, his eyes scanning the chaos of the battlefield. The sight of so many dead and dying, human and Bajoran alike, greatly troubled on his soul. This was the true face of war, stripped of all glory and heroism. As he turned to head back to the command post, a small figure caught his eye. A young Losian girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old, was picking her way through the debris, clutching a battered doll to her chest. Her face was streaked with tears, but there was a tenacity in her step that belied her age. She walked up to Greg, her wide eyes fixed on his face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of the battlefield. "Thank you for saving us from the monsters." She held out the doll, pressing it into Greg's hand. He looked down at the small, worn toy, a lump forming in his throat. To this child, he and his men were heroes, saviors who had delivered her people from the clutches of the Bajorans. But Greg knew the reality was far more complicated. The humans may have won the battle, but the cost had been high. He thought of the families back on Earth who would soon receive the dreaded knock on the door, the news that their loved ones would never be coming home. He looked out over the battlefield, watching as the bodies of the fallen were loaded onto transport ships. The sacrifices of these brave men and women would be forever etched into the history of this war, but for their families, the pain of loss would never fully heal. Greg's mind turned to the Bajoran soldiers, many of them little more than conscripts, who had fought and died for a cause they may not have fully understood. In the end, there were no true winners in war. only those who survived to bear the burden of the fallen. The medic approached, his uniform stained with blood. "Sir, we've got the triage center set up. We're ready to start evacuating the wounded." Greg nodded, handing the doll back to the little girl. "Get to safety," he told her, his voice gentle. "The monsters are gone now." As the child scampered off, Greg turned to the medic. "Let's get our people home." The two men walked towards the waiting transport ships, ready to begin the long journey back to Earth. Greg knew that the road ahead would be difficult, with many more battles to be fought and sacrifices to be made. But he also knew that he and his men would continue to fight, to protect the innocent, and stand against the darkness that threatened to engulf the galaxy. For that was the duty of a soldier, and the price of being human. As the transport ships lifted off, carrying the wounded and the fallen, Greg looked up at the stars, wondering what the future held. The war was not nearly finished, and the Bajorans would undoubtedly be back, seeking revenge for their defeat. But the humans would be ready, their perseverance stronger than ever in the face of adversity, and as Greg looked down at the small, battered doll in his hand, he was reminded of why they fought and what they stood for. For in the end, it was not about glory or conquest, but about protecting the innocent and preserving the light of hope in a galaxy consumed by darkness, and that was a cause worth fighting for, at any expense. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.